All right, I want to thank you all for coming here today for the December meeting of the John Locke Book Club. We're going to go through the second half of the treatise on government today. I trust you've all done the background reading, and I will be calling on the audience for questions throughout. So this is the second in an informal series that Tech Freedom and the Competitive Enterprise Institute and now the International Center for Law and Economics have been doing together about room for agreement. There's a lot of division in government right now, a lot of frustration about what's actually going to happen. We did an event recently on communications law, prospects for reform, with our friends at Public Knowledge and Ray Gifford and Fred Campbell at CEI. And I think we found there was a lot of common ground. So the topic we're handling today is one that many have told us can't be done in a constructive civil way, that there are some people here in the audience today who think that free marketeers should never ever talk about copyright because it's essentially the abortion issue of our field, and people just get too bent out of shape. So we really put our heads together today and found a panel of people who have significant disagreements, but I think all will respect each other and perhaps find some common ground. So our theme today is copyright. What's great about it? Maybe what's not? What should be changed? I'm going to guide the panel here today through discussion on those topics. We'll turn to questions from the audience, but I want to first thank the Committee on Administration for lending us this lovely room. Thank all of you for coming. Ask you politely to turn off your cell phones. Remind you that the hashtag for today's event is RightCR, which is shorter than Free Market Copyright Perspectives or something like that. And with that, just very briefly point you to the list of panelists we have today, and just go down the list so everyone knows who's who. Adam Mossoff on my right teaches at George Mason Law School and is particularly focused on copyright. Jeff Manny with the International Center for Law and Economics, one of our hosts today, is also quite focused on copyright, works on law and economics in general. Okay. We're switching the name tags.
I'm just trusting that that's correct. I have no idea.
And this is organized roughly in a spectrum today. Adam here is very generally supportive of copyright. Jeff as well. Ryan is somewhat in the middle. And we have a range of opinions. Ron Roddy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, also our co-sponsor. Covers a range of issues, but copyright is key among them. Jerry Brito at the Marketeers Center just published a book on perspectives on copyright, and might tell us a little bit about those today. And Larry Downs, author of The Laws of Disruption, takes a perspective about technological disruption that makes him skeptical about a lot of things, probably including copyright. So having said all that, I'm going to kick it off to the panel, and as I said, I'll turn to questions from the audience. And I wanted to get started by asking all of you, before we get into the current debates about copyright, just to briefly provide some thoughts on what you think the purposes of copyright are, and most importantly, what are the measures of success? So how do we strike the right balance? How do we know when we've struck that balance? And I'll just take it from the left here, or from the right, from your perspective. Adam, get us started.
As an initial question, what's the purpose of copyright? I think copyright is a property right, and like any other property right, and like any other right is itself, is intended to secure to people a domain of freedom to productively use the values that they have created or have acquired from others through free trade. And as a right, therefore, it serves two, I think, very important functions, as all rights were recognized as serving in the founding era, and that is, as a property right, it secures to the creators the fruits of their productive labors, and all rights, when you secure those fruits, it results in happy, productive, flourishing economy and flourishing society. So the focus on progress in the Constitution is actually consistent with the natural rights justification of all rights, life, liberty, and property, or as framed in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Which is, I think, copyright is very much part of.
So I incorporate everything Adam said by reference, and I would just add the economic perspective. I think the purpose of copyright, again, like all property rights, is to is to facilitate a system that permits the maximization of economic welfare. That requires exchange, and it requires specialization. And copyright, like all property rights, facilitates specialization. There's no reason to think that someone who creates a copyrightable work is necessarily the best person to market it or commercialize it. This is true in patents as well. There's no reason to think that the entity best situated to distribute a work is also likely to be the one in the best position to create them. And so I believe that everyone is well served by well-defined tradable rights that facilitate that kind of specialization, that ultimately ensure that the maximum, optimal, I shouldn't say maximum, the optimal level of creation occurs, and that the optimal level of distribution, marketing, and commercialization occurs. And that's not just to the benefit of the producers. In fact, in terms of the metrics question, it's essential that we judge the value of the system or any change in the system not by virtue of how well it benefits the creators or owners of works, but also by how well it benefits also those who don't own work. And again, I still believe that the copyright system is essential to maximize benefits for everyone. It's not just for the creators.
My perspective is very similar to Jeff's, that copyright, like property rights, facilitates the creation of wealth. And that is a fundamental purpose of government. But also it poses a challenge in terms of shaping the scope of that right as society changes, as technology evolves. Just as our rights in land changed considerably over the years with the advent of airplanes, for instance, so too is it really important that copyright reflect the realities of the world we live in. The world we live in is much different today than it was 10 or 20 years ago, in large part thanks to the internet. The amount of attention that's being paid on Capitol Hill to making sure that copyright reflects the realities of the information age, to me, is an excellent thing. That even though that there are reasonable and good faith disagreements about exactly how to make sure copyright stays with the times, that simply leaving it alone probably isn't the best path, because there are real challenges, both on the side of making sure that we enforce copyrights effectively, and also on the side of making sure that we're not actually causing problems with coordination, with clearing rights, with making sure that we're not only just incentivizing the creation of expressive works, but also that we're making sure that they're being distributed and commercialized in the most effective and broadest possible way. We'll get into some of the details on these fronts later, but to reiterate, copyright is very much consistent with a free market perspective on governance that seeks to harness property rights to facilitate the creation of wealth, of which increasingly intangible and non-rival goods play a role as more and more information starts to flow on the internet, and we devote more and more of our lives in the digital ecosystem.
So what do I think the purpose of copyright is? I think it is exactly what the Constitution says the purpose of copyright is, which is to promote the progress of science. So the Constitution says is the purpose of copyright, and I agree with that. And how do you achieve that? Well, I incorporate by reference Jeff's comments about the economic purposes of copyright, which is to sort of reach an optimal social welfare, that we can get through the creation of information goods.
So copyright is not a property right. It's a legal fiction, and it carves out a certain narrow class of sort of human intellectual activity, and by extension leaves out all other human intellectual activity, and creates a temporary ability to control that through a very series of rights. Unlike, for example, a traditional property right, it disappears utterly at some point in time. And if I remember my feudal property law, that would be the equivalent of a springing executory interest, which the rule in Shelley's case made non-applicable to traditional property. So in that sense, it's not property. It's a license. It's a temporary license. It has limitations in terms of its scope and what it applies to, and what therefore it does not apply to. And I think we'll get to this, I'm sure, next. But one of the things that makes it difficult to talk about copyright and the problems with copyright and reform for copyright is using the metaphor of property to describe it, I think actually hurts the discussion more than it helps, at least now, maybe not 200 years ago.
Okay, well, so this has got a lot of attention here. Do you want to engage on this, Jeff?
I was actually suggesting that perhaps Adam would want to engage on that specific point if we want to delve into the history.
I mean, do you want to spend time on the history, or do you want to get more
It'd be
into the
less fun.
ongoing policy debates?
Before we jump into the ongoing policy debates, I think the right question to start with is, this is about big picture and trade-offs. So you've all shared your perspectives on the purposes of copyright. How do you strike the right balance, Adam?
Yeah, I don't know if exactly balance is the appropriate perspective to take when thinking about copyright. When we talk about property rights, all property rights, whether property rights in water or property rights in oil and gas or property rights in land or property rights in animals, which are all different types of assets that people put to productive uses and or create, and therefore are secured an exclusive domain of use, control, and disposition over. We don't talk about, well, how do we balance these rights against other rights? We talk about what within this domain do we secure to them the exclusive ability to control and profit from their productive labors. And I think copyright is a different type of asset, of course, from land or from animals, just the same way that oil and gas and animals are different from land. And so there's obviously different types of control that the legal system provides, given the nature and differences in the subject matter. And for this reason, it wasn't, intellectual property didn't kind of arise whole cloth in the 18th century or 19th century and was unknown to judges or legislators. There was a concept of intellectual property in the common law. It was called incorporeal hereditaments. We thankfully changed it to intellectual property, but of course it addressed such issues as future interests. And as I teach my students every year, future interests exist. They're very real. They're separate, self-standing interests. Executory interests actually are valid legal rights today, to this very day.
That's wrong.
And executory interests are valid, and as are other types of future interests. And so, yes, obviously there are going to be different types of protections and controls, but the point is that the focus is not how do we balance this against other rights or other concerns. It's how do we ensure the equal protection of this particular property right, this particular sphere of liberty of use of an asset, that's such that it's equal with other uses of other claims to other types of assets and uses as well.
So I would especially echo the point about being wary of the balancing framework or setup, because I think for a lot of people, it may not be the way you meant it, Baron, but for a lot of people it implies that there is a conflict between rights holders and users. And I'm sure there are people who believe there's a conflict between Walmart and its customers, but most of us understand that that's really not a helpful way of understanding the relationship between rights holders and those who might have an interest in taking advantage of those rights. The rights holder has an interest has that same interest, because to the extent that the user or the potential user is willing to pay for access, that is the extent to which the right holder has the incentive to create and commercialize the right in the first place. It's a collaborative sort of thing, co-opetition, I think somebody has called it. Of course, the rights holder or the seller is interested in maximizing his or her share of the pie. And of course, the user is interested in maximizing his or her share of the pie. But as a good economist, I could care less about the distribution of wealth in that fashion. I care about the allocation that leads to the maximization of the size of the pie. If rights holders can get more power to them. If users can get more power to them. But that's not a conflict that we should be all that concerned about. All we should worry about is maximizing the size of the pie.
Jerry, Larry?
So I take Jeff's point that when he says that we shouldn't think about this as a conflict between creators and users, and I think you're right that you can. Oh, you know what? I have my thing turned on. Let me just repeat that I take Jeff's point that we shouldn't be thinking about a conflict between creators and users, because you do want to think that people can contract around anything. So I think that's right. But here's where I think that there is a little bit of a conflict. One way that intellectual property is a different kind of property, and I do think that copyright is property, is a little bit different from, say, personal property in your iPad, is that the fact that you own your iPad doesn't hurt me at all, doesn't matter to me at all, right? So all I have to do is stay away from it, stay away from your iPad, but it doesn't hurt my ability to use my own iPad or do nothing. Now, if you own a copyright over a poem that you wrote, it is a restriction on my ability, my printing press, if I want to make copies of it. It's a restriction on my vocal cords if I want to recite it. Now, if I recite it, I'm doing nothing to you. You still have your poem. You can still, recite it, do whatever you want with it. So, the fact that you have a copyright is necessarily a restriction on some other common law rights that I have. Now, is that a bad thing? It is not a bad thing. We absolutely need to have those kinds of restrictions. It's a trade that we make. We trade allowing ourselves to have those kinds of restrictions in order to incentivize people like Jeff to write beautiful poetry, as I know that he does. And so the question is, that's where the balance comes in, right? We want to make sure that Jeff has enough of an incentive so that he will create beautiful property, but no more, because more means restrictions on my traditional property, my traditional common law rights, more than would be necessary to incentivize it. So the balance, I would think, is that's what I would think.
But it doesn't actually restrict
Yeah.
your right to, say, use your printing press, for example. You can run your printing press 24/7 to the full extent of its ability, printing something other than the thing that I own if we can't agree on terms on which I can license it to you. You could torture that into a conflict.
But can I show you? Can I
just
just briefly tell you how I think it's different? Right? Is that if I do print something that you wrote, it does not affect you in any way. The way that if I use your iPad, there's a clear effect on.
It
your
affects
welfare.
me if I could have sold the
does.
copy of that poetry that you're otherwise, say, giving away.
Correct. And so then the question is, and so you're right. So which is why I do think that we should have copyright in order to incentivize you to create. Now the question then becomes is how much of how long of a copyright? And there are many different sort of vectors and on which we could sort of constrain copyright. So, but let's just say how long. That's an easy one to focus on. Well, the founders, for example, balanced it at 14 years renewable for 14 more. Today, we have it at life of the author plus 70 years. So we've seen that the balancing has changed. So that's the balancing we're talking about. There clearly is a balancing. I don't think you can say that balancing is the right way to think about it.
So I'm surprised actually to hear Jeff say that there's not a conflict here. My way of thinking about how markets work is that that's what they are. They're conflicts between buyers and sellers. And that's the way I think about this is it's a market problem. I think what makes this difficult and why balance is the right way to talk about it is this is a market that was created with a built-in market failure. Because it's an exclusive right, it's a monopoly right, and monopolies from an economic standpoint introduce some level, could be a lot, could be a little, but some level of deadweight loss. And the point here is to try and figure out what set of conditions would do the best job of minimizing the deadweight loss so that it looks as much like a competitive, regular old, plain old competitive free market as possible. So the balance comes in talking about, all right, what rights do we give, what rights do we not give, what things do we do, what things do we not do to minimize deadweight loss in what might otherwise be a functioning market.
But so one of the things that I think is really troubling about the monopoly argument about copyright is the extent to which it really just doesn't apply. By which I mean I take your point about potential deadweight loss. And I'm sure one can identify examples of copyrighted works for which there are simply no substitutes. But Jerry's got a copy of his book right there. Jerry is not selling that book at an infinite price. Now that's for a couple of reasons. One, because it's just not that good. But actually, I mean, that's a joke, but the part of it is, of course, that even the worst monopolist in the world can't sell at an infinite price because there's always an alternative, which is not buying it at all. And that's the deadweight loss possibility. Somebody doesn't buy it at the going price. But I think more importantly for this is that, I haven't looked at Amazon lately, but there's probably about 600 books that directly sort of compete on the same topic as Jerry's book.
Nope, that's pretty
when
unique.
when you're looking for, and when you're thinking about competition in terms of what the consumers are looking for, there's a near infinite number of sort of alternatives to consumption of Jerry's book, which is why Jerry's book sells for, tell me how much?
In paperback, $12.95. But
$12.95.
in book, $3.99 for ebook.
Right. Now, I want some royalties for that. $12.95. Now, that doesn't, admittedly, I don't know exactly, no one does, what the optimal price would be. But I find it hard to believe that some powerful monopolist like Jerry can only get $12.95 for his book.
Jerry,
Can I jump in here?
please.
So I think that this discussion, the dismissal of balance was a mistake. In fact, I think that all of the property rights that we recognize and create are exercises in balancing acts. There are certain assets that we don't allow people to own as property. You can't own an air right in the sky to the heavens. At the same time, you can own a life estate and land. You can't when it comes to a tangible item. The fact is that all questions about when to create a property right and the scope of it are questions about how do we best ensure the asset is used. When does a property right make sense? If you're an employee of Coca-Cola and you steal their formula, you violated their rights. But if you reverse engineer their formula and create a superior product, you haven't violated their rights. The question of whether we should have a right against the world in copies and whether it should be 1 year or infinite, those are all fundamentally practical questions that have to be dominated by an analysis of when are we best serving the society at large. Should we have registration for copyrights, for instance? That's a question that has to be determined based on practical considerations.
See,
For
I
rights holders, it'll help others. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I disagree with that characterization because all of your firstly, you can own your air rights, and in fact, the Penn Central case, a very famous regulatory takings case, is a very famous regulatory taking because multi-million-dollar air rights were taken from Penn Central by the city of New York and its landmark preservation statute. So it's not true that you don't have property rights in air.
His point was they're not infinite.
It's to the heavens.
The Alcolum rule, which is what you're referring to, was a rule that was formulated when people couldn't go into the air, and so for the common law, it was largely rhetoric. It wasn't an actual legal rule. It represented more the sense of you had a sphere of dominion within your land, including up to about 30 or 40 feet off the land, which is about as high people would go in the 17th century. But it wasn't an active legal rule. And as people developed the technology to go into the air, they actually defined, per the subject matter of this new asset and this new value that was being created through technology, ways in which it could be captured, exclusively defined in terms of its use and disposition, and turned into a value that could be exchanged and capitalized on the market. In effect, this represents the whole thesis about how when assets become valuable, there's an incentive to internalize it. And so it's not an issue of balancing, it's an issue of recognizing what the subject matter is that is now capable of exclusive use and productive exchange.
Okay, so Larry, you write about technological disruption. Adam has just put his finger on the difficult problem of the law has to change over time. Can copyright keep up with technological change?
Of course. Has it? No.
Well, and how would it? I mean, is there a way you see to fix the failure of copyright thus far to keep up with that change?
Sure, but I thought we were sort of talking about practical things that could actually happen in the real world. And since there's utterly no possibility of a reform to the Copyright Act, why would we waste our time talking about it?
Well, okay, so thank you for coming today, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a great panel, the shortest one ever.
Right, so that was my facetious. Let me give the real answer. And I should say, it's very odd to be sitting metaphorically and physically at the far left end of this table. I don't know Adam, but I think the rest of you I could say for confidence, I'm the only person at this table who has ever made a substantial amount of money on a copyright. In 1998, I wrote a book, and despite all the best efforts of my publisher, it sold. And it sold 200,000 copies. And when all was said and done, I actually had some money. And not very much. But as these things go, it was good. So I'm just saying, as a practical matter, I can tell you as an author that the copyright system is broken, and it's broken for authors, it's broken for publishers, it's broken for distributors, it's broken for customers. It's not impossible to repair in any stretch. We just, in fact, haven't repaired it. Instead of repairing it, as we've tried to repair it with perhaps the best of intentions, perhaps sometimes without the best of intention, we've made it worse. And I'm really just talking about in the last, in my lifetime, the last 50 years.
Okay, so before we get into how to fix it and whether there's any consensus on the panel about how to do that, I just have to ask to close out this section about the big picture here. Many of you, I'm sure, I suppose probably no one in this room missed the Republican Study Committee memo that raised a lot of attention to this issue. And I'm curious, there were several things in there that I think that really made it difficult for people who were reading that memo to try to take the utilitarian message. And some of those were, for example, saying that copyright is inconsistent with every tenet of laissez-faire capitalism. Does anybody on the panel actually agree with that?
No.
Okay. Does anybody think it's fair to say that copyright, quote, destroys entire industries without mentioning that it sustains entire industries?
Wait, so what part are you quoting?
So the question is, so the memo says that copyright destroys entire industries.
Yes.
It doesn't mention the industries that are sustained by copyright.
Right.
So how would you have, if you think that there's something to that point, how would you have put that in a more nuanced way?
Well, I think the way you just did, which is, of course, like all bodies of law, and frankly, like all disruptive technologies, it destroys and creates. And whether on balance we did the best possible job we could, or whether we could have done a better job, well, ex post, not usually a very interesting discussion to have. But yes, of course, copyright by definition, by excluding some activities, destroys them, and by extension, by creating other activities, it sustains them. And the question again is, did we do a good job, or rather, are we still doing a good job?
Jerry?
I think it's a bit much, or it's overstating the case to say that it destroys complete industries, et cetera. So, not exactly the way I would put it. But to go to your follow-up, which is, but this also sustains other industries. That's the balance, as it were, that was missing here. They've only had mentioned this other thing, then it would be fine. And what my problem with that is that we have to go back to what is the purpose of copyright. The purpose of copyright is to promote the progress of science. It is not to sustain industries. It is not to make anybody rich. That is a wonderful byproduct, as Larry suggested of himself, but it is not the purpose of copyright. The purpose of copyright is to promote the progress of science.
And what about the useful arts? In favor
Well,
of those
there's
or
a debate
against
about this, about how you want to read the clause. So it's a copyright and patent clause, and does copyright is about the progress of science, whereas patents is about the progress of useful arts.
So then let's get into specific issues. The one that always comes up, it's come up already today, is about copyright terms. And of course, the Eldred case really, in many ways, began the popular perception certainly among law students, that there was something deeply wrong with the copyright system. But Jeff, you have some skepticism about that claim. How do you respond?
Well, so I think that there's two important responses. One is the term, the length of copyright, as Larry pointed out, is far from the most important or relevant aspect of copyright today. I mean, it matters a lot if your copyright is about to expire and you're still exploiting that right, but that's undoubtedly the tiny exception rather than the rule. And on a daily basis, the DMCA and SOPA and those sorts of aspects of our broad copyright law are absolutely paramount and relevant to the way copyright-intensive industries are functioning. And I doubt that term, and we can have people here in the audience who can speak to this more directly, but I doubt that the actual term factors into their thinking about copyright or about how they run their business on a more than sporadic basis. The second thing is that while I like the rule of law, I don't like the idea of ex post facto laws and the like. And there are problems, not the least of which the political sort of problems with the Copyright Term Extension Act. The fact that there are important benefits of a copyright that are not simply creation is very important to understanding the actual effects of something like a copyright term extension. If all you think the role of copyright is to incentivize creation, then you're absolutely right when you say retroactively doing that doesn't do much to increase the incentive to create, unless people had some expectation that that would happen in the future. So you can make some slight argument, but not much of one. But if you understand that copyright has other functions, then that mitigates the alleged problems of the copyright term extension. I don't know for sure whether it's the appropriate. No one knows if it's exactly the right place or not. I mean, listen, to put it this way: the government did it. Let's assume it's wrong. But that doesn't mean that any feasible
But
alternative is
Jeff,
where
just
you
clarify
said.
for the audience, what other purposes do you have in mind besides incentivizing creation?
The commercialization, specialization that I talked about facilitates exchange. I take Larry's point, or I'm sorry, Jerry's point about the purpose of copyright is not to preserve particular industries, but I do believe that the ability to contract and specialize and therefore, as a byproduct, create industries like, say, the music industry is entirely a function of the availability of tradable copyrights, and that is not a function of that's not a part of the, that doesn't turn on the incentive to create. That is a function of copyrights that's enormously important and valuable that arises after creation has occurred.
Adam, I want to hear you from the other side, but briefly.
I agree and incorporate by reference Jeff's comments that
I'm at it.
I'm someone I don't get extremely upset about the copyright term. I'm not. In fact, I don't get upset at all. I'm perfectly. I have to confess, I'm somewhat happy with life of author plus 70 years. I don't think it's something to storm the gates on. John Locke in 1695 proposed a copyright term of life of author plus 70 years. So this is not something that's in 1695.
So,
yeah, and the great founders of law and economics proposed perpetual copyright. I think it's much more important that you have that you copyright defined as a property right. Both because that's the only basis by which creators can be rewarded for their labors through the commercialization of this very important creative asset through either music labels or publishers.
Ryan?
To build on that, another thing that is often confused about copyright is that it, in many ways, actually promotes public access to creative works. There's more than one way to monetize creative works. Increasingly, if you can have user agreements, click-through contracts, like you do when you buy an iTunes song. There's also digital rights management. This doesn't require copyright enforcement, yet because of copyright enforcement, we have business models like broadcasting, like YouTube, where people don't have to sign a contract, people don't have to pay. The creator can rely on a legal assurance that their work will not be commercially infringed without enforcement. So there are a lot of business models where copyrights actually mean that the public has greater access to works than they might without copyright because of all of the alternatives to copyright, which largely involve less access to creative works because of the reliance on contract law and technology to build fences. So by reducing fencing costs, copyright in many ways furthers.
Okay, but the question here is about copyright terms. Jerry, you must.
So the original question was about.
You must hate them. Come on.
No, I mean the original question was about retroactive copyright term extension, right? And so the idea is, so you have a creation and it gets, let's say, 100 years worth of protection. And then at the end of those 100 years, during which the creator has had the opportunity, so number one, there's enough incentive there for that person to create the work. At the end of that time, and it's enough time for 100 years over which they had the opportunity to commercialize and promote and market the product and attempt to make a profit, et cetera. At the end of the time, we decide we want to give them another extra 20 years. I don't understand why, how you justify that, right? So think of Santa Claus. Do we think that that we could get Santa Claus better marketed, better distributed if we made it the exclusive right of somebody to have Santa Claus? No, Santa Claus belongs to us all, and as a result, he's everywhere.
In fact, he's right here in the room.
There he is.
Larry, you want final word on copyright terms?
Well, now I've lost track of the question.
Retroactive.
Do you think copyright terms should be significantly shortened?
Yes.
And why?
Oh, That's no fun. Well, I think it was, no, let's say the dissenting justice in Eldred, but I think it was Justice Breyer, but I don't want to say that if I'm wrong. I think cited some economic studies that suggested that for 99% of all copyrighted works, the effective lifespan was much shorter than the copyright term. So in effect, the current term amounts to perpetual license.
And I think the argument would be that if only we gave them 20 more years,
Yeah.
they would have an opportunity to commercialize it.
So the practical problem is, there's I can't remember the rule against perpetuities in property law. It's life plus.
An interest must
gas
vest
to 21.
within
How many
life
years?
within 21 years of a
20
life
years.
and being.
So the practical purpose of that is that after a couple of generations, it's extraordinarily difficult to figure out who has the residual rights to property right to any piece of property, because it's especially one that can be subdivided and chopped up the way copyright and other intangibles can be. So oil license and so on, glass license. So the term, the lengthy term that we have now, for most authors, it's irrelevant because their commercial life is much shorter than that anyway. A piece of software, there's no piece of software that ever had value beyond 20 years in its original form. Of course, it gets rewritten over time and updated, but so for a practical purpose, for most authors, it doesn't provide any incentive because they're not going to get anything out of it anyway. And for some authors, it's very valuable because they are active. They've not divided the right, so they still hold their vault, and they're still commercializing the vault. And for them, of course, the longer the term, the better. The problem is this gray area in the middle for all these things that are still technically under copyright, for which it is impossible, if not effectively impossible, to figure out who actually has the rights. And that, which we refer to as the orphan works, and that gets to be a larger and larger body of things over time as we keep extending the term. And, yes, we can solve the orphan. Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I just one thing I would say that I think is often missed in the orphan works debate, which is it doesn't become a larger and larger body over time, because eventually everything that at one point was copyrighted does indeed go into the public domain. I mean, there is an end point to the orphan works problem. Now, it's true that the longer the term is, the more potential orphan works there are, until everything that was written in whatever year.
But how do you know what year it was written? How do you know who it belonged to? We've gotten rid of all registries, all formalities.
Yeah,
and that's what creates a orphan works problem.
Okay, wait. Hold on.
Yeah.
It's my panel. What created the orphan works problem?
I thought it was our panel.
What created the problem?
Well, I think the key to the orphan works problem is the fact that we have removed formalities. So you no longer have to register. We've gone, look, I think quite like Adam, I think what makes copyright very wonderful and useful is the more it looks like property. The more property like we can make copyright, the better it is. But we've moved away from that. Where today,
So you don't like fair use?
I don't understand. I don't see how that follows.
Do you like fair use of your home?
I like fair use.
Is a very liability rule-like aspect, not property-like.
The more we can make it like property, the better it will work.
Except for fair use.
Except for
No.
fair use.
Well, fair
When you're designing,
fair use
I'm waiting
reflects
for
what we call in property.
I'm waiting for Baron to say my panel.
It's my panel. No, well, we've got an agenda here to go through. There's a lot of questions. So just
Just really
But
quickly
this,
from a
this gets to the heart of why copyright is so special, is because we can sort of design it however we want. Anyhow, but to answer your question about orphan works,
Yes.
all right? I think it has to do with the fact that we no longer have a registry that we can go and look up who owns something.
So how would you see that working? Your registration system, would you split the term and require?
I think splitting the term into 2 or more terms makes sense because it allows for works to fall into the public domain before the entire term is up. But what's more key is that if you want to have copyright, it's not automatic. It's not an opt-out system. It's an opt-in system. If you want copyright on a work that you've created, by all means, you can have it. You just need to signal to the government. You need to register and say who you are.
As a practical matter, that is a problem in the treaties forbid that. So for what it's worth, it's not really on the table. I don't
So are
think.
we limiting ourselves to
I'm
what's
not saying-
practical? Because if we are, then we should.
I just wanted to raise that. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that you can't make theoretical arguments in favor of or against formalities, But again, it's just important to point out that that's not really on the table, nor do I, because those treaties I think have enormous value, nor do I necessarily think it should be. That said, I'm happy to have the debate about the benefits or costs of formalities, and I'm all in favor of formalities.
Well, maybe we should
Well,
talk
maybe
about
we should
what
talk
is
about
on the
that.
table,
Yeah.
because we would probably find that everything that's happened in the preceding 45 minutes was just rhetorical irrelevance.
Okay, so Larry, what do you think, what would be your top 3 changes to fix the copyright system?
Okay, so, and that's a good
good.
point to introduce. So Jim DeLong was sitting here, wrote a piece in the National Review that, not to characterize Jim's work, but that was highly skeptical of the RSC memo, and on what I might think of as sort of religious grounds. And, so we can have the religious conversation, that's what we've been having. And then, on page 3 of my printout, he gets to reforms, at which point I say, well, I'm in complete agreement. So the proceeding and everything that comes after this is completely irrelevant. So I'll just read what Jim said. And as far as I'm concerned, great, let's do that. He says, many specific reforms should be enacted. My list would include shorter copyright terms, a requirement of registration and renewal to show seriousness, a one-time requirement of registration of existing works to get rid of the orphan works problem, and centralized databases to reduce transaction costs. The question of dealing with internet piracy is damned hard, and no one has a good answer. Realistically, the system can tolerate a lot of leakage at the retail level as long as creators retain the right to move against commercial-grade piracy. Done.
Is it that simple? Jeff?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that again, as I said before, the debate over term and honestly over orphan works too. These are relative to the piracy and internet problems de minimis. There may be people for whom that's not entirely true, but I think economy-wide, that's true. So as Jim points out, there is this problem we don't have a very good solution to, but part of that solution has got to be the very things that animated SOPA, the very things that animate part of the DMCA, the ability for rights protectors to have an efficient means of protecting themselves against massive infringement. And a really important point in all of copyright, and it's probably true in other areas too, but it just seems so self-evident. Copyright is, in a lot of respects, the law is not the relevant limitation. It's technology. The law isn't doing a huge amount of work here. What's really affecting the extent of infringement and the ability to prevent it is technology. So laws that are directed toward technology, while they're thorny for reasons that Jerry and Larry can elaborate on at length, they're essential. That's where the debate needs to go. And no one has a perfect answer to it, but one thing I would just throw out is we absolutely shouldn't be throwing out SOPA. That particular implementation may have been problematic, was problematic, but the impetus behind it is absolutely essential.
Can I just say one thing that I agree with you, that is where the debate is and should be, but the problem is that when we focus the debate there, we sort of begin to forget about issues like the orphan works problem, like our ever-increasing copyright terms, which the last one was 98. I can expect a Copyright Extension Act to be introduced, relatively soon. I wouldn't be surprised if one was. And so you're right, we should have that conversation, but why don't we, meet us halfway? Let's have a comprehensive look at this that discusses that, but also looks at some of these other concerns, including orphan works, including terms, et cetera.
Well, yeah, I think what Jerry just pointed out is crucial, that people who might describe themselves as copyright skeptics have some legitimate beef, whether it's the forfeiture of websites without an opportunity for the site owner to appear before the court, whether it's statutory damages being too high, whether it's the orphan works problem. These are things that should be up for discussion in the same way as we're discussing what to do about enforcement, about rogue websites, and about illegal intermediaries who do the bare minimum required by the DMCA, but no more. There are a lot of technological solutions that work pretty well, like YouTube Content ID is a wonderful example, but the tough discussion is whether the law should do more to force other intermediaries to behave as well as some of the more responsible ones are. I think that's a difficult question, not whether it should, but how to go about that without imposing excessive burdens, especially on small user-generated startups. But that's the sort of discussion that I think we need to have. And if you only focus on one angle, getting people to the table is going to be difficult because of the fact that I think both the people who care about enforcement, people who care about things like orphan works, have serious concerns that should be addressed by Congress within the constraints of international law.
So, Ryan, understanding that there are other legitimate concerns here and taking Jerry's point to heart about a need for a comprehensive assessment of this, how would you deal with the problem of rogue websites? Take us back to the debate last year about SOPA, PIPA, and the Open Act alternative. What could you support?
Who are you asking me?
Well, I'd love to hear from anyone, but I'll start with Ryan, unless you want to jump in.
I think that the Open Act wasn't a workable approach for various reasons. The venue that it chose, the International Trade Commission, while it has many excellent attributes and potentially some good commissioners down the line, it wasn't, I don't think, a serious approach. That said, I think there are elements of SOPA that while perhaps not likely to be introduced in Congress anytime soon, ideally would be, despite the valid concerns about going after rogue websites by requiring payment providers, ad networks, potentially search engines to cut off access to them. I think that those solutions are reasonable, especially if they can be crafted in a way that ensures small offshore websites aren't getting shut down without any judge actually just deciding whether a rights holder or a government official is making a legitimate case that they're doing the wrong thing. So to me, we should be approaching the rogue websites issue with a lens that resembles that of SOPA, but with more focus on due process and a sensitivity to the fact that we're imposing real burdens on intermediaries who may not be the ones who should bear as much of the burden as SOPA would place on them.
Or maybe they should be compensated.
Jeff, explain what you mean by that point.
Well, I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't exactly, not like I know that there's a workable solution to this, but one of the problems of SOPA, the DMCA, is that the burdens it puts on intermediaries. Sometimes, by the way, simply to act out competition between other competitors in another market, where allegedly some significant percentage of takedown notices are actually competitors trying to remove competitors' works. That kind of thing doesn't seem like something that we should just blithely saddle intermediaries with the burden of dealing with. Except that they probably are precisely the most efficient place to locate that technological fix. So one possible solution then is do indeed place the burden there, but find some way to compensate them so that they don't have an argument that they're being overburdened and overtaxed and can't actually run their businesses because they're spending all their time with takedown notices. I don't think that's really true, but fine. Let's
Jerry?
find a way to compensate them.
Yeah, I associate myself with both what Ryan and Jeff just said. And I don't have a ready alternative to SOPA that I can sort of give you right now, but there are certain things that you can look about what was wrong with SOPA that you could try to avoid in a future bill. One, for example, would be, First Amendment concerns. It's very different to require an intermediary to not make a financial transaction, not allow a financial transaction to take place, versus having them not speak in a way, right? It's very different.
You mean, say, filtering them from the DNS?
Exactly, right. And so you can also think about, well, and here's the final thing that I'll say about legislative fixes to what is a technological problem, is that you have to do a cost-benefit analysis, which is what you're getting at with your compensation. And at some point, and I'm not happy about this, but at some point it may well be the case that the benefits to these kinds of laws do not outweigh the costs of the sort that you have to impose. And maybe we internalize that through requiring that these companies be compensated, but we should be focused on that. We should be thinking about that.
Larry?
Yeah, so I'll take my chair's view of this. I think the problem was buried in one of the versions of SOPA was a requirement for a study to determine the actual extent of the problem. And I'll go back to Jim's phrase, which was commercial grade piracy. The data that we have on the nature and the scope and the sources and so on commercial grade piracy is fiction at best. And I can't tell you how to fix SOPA, and I'm not opposed to the idea of changing the enforcement mechanisms to make them more effective and to sort of tolerate the useful leakage and not tolerate the unuseful leakage, but the data just doesn't exist yet. And it's not that it can't be collected, but it's not there.
Okay, so to close the conversation about enforcement, Ryan, you mentioned asset forfeiture as a specific issue, and I think you also alluded to criminal sanctions and copyright. So do you think, does anybody, just ask this as a question to the panel, does anybody think that there should be criminal provisions in the copyright law, or should copyright be handled solely through civil remedies?
Well, to the extent that they're required by treaty, yes. But I do think that in the abstract, criminalization is difficult, if for no other reason than it can impede the very sort of exchange that Adam and I have been promoting, in the sense that you can't alienate your right that you don't even have to not criminally prosecute. So it complicates the ability to that you don't have in patents, for example, to engage in the kind of commercialization trade around property rights that you would otherwise have. And that's not to say that is to identify a cost of criminalization. It's not to say necessarily that the costs outweigh the benefits. And again, there's a international treaty aspect.
Jerry?
So I agree with Jeff, which is, by the way, I have to remark, right? This is pretty amazing. We're agreeing a lot.
As I think we did in the podcast.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think it's good to highlight to folks that, what we're saying in this book is not radical. And
I wouldn't go that.
no, but for example, in the book, there's a chapter that talks about the costs of criminalization. And you framed it as binary. Should we have criminalization or not? And, let's talk about assuming we have criminalization. The question is, there's a balance there too. How much? That's a cost-benefit question. And there's a chapter in the book that discusses the effect of outsized criminal penalties for potential infringement. And you can think about companies like YouTube that when they were starting up, the worst that they faced was a civil liability that would put them out of business, right? And you can imagine a situation where now startups might think to themselves, if the law isn't interpreted the way we think it should be, the worst case for us is we end up in jail. And they may not go ahead with a startup idea. Now, I'm not saying that this has happened all the time, but the point is that this is the kind of thinking, kind of analysis we have to do.
Right, so and you're right, it's not necessarily binary. One solution commonly employed in these kinds of situations is punitive penalties.
Right.
Right. That's how you enforce a property right.
Right.
Punitive monetary penalties.
Yeah. Right. So the point is to focus the mind and incentivize and result as much as possible in an outcome where no one is choosing the penalty as the price for infringement. So the penalty has to be extraordinarily high. Now, criminal penalties do that in a sort of
Ham-handed.
easy way, but
And jailbreaking doesn't work in that context,
and you can
right?
convert it into a punitive monetary penalty.
So,
I would
Ryan?
add that I disagree with Tom Bell on many things, but he has an interesting example that if we really wanted to eliminate copyright infringement, we have the Copyright Act, which imposes the death penalty on infringers. That would be an excellent enforcement mechanism that I think no one here would support. I don't think it's likely that innocent infringers are going to go to jail. It's also worth noting there aren't very many criminal prosecutions for copyright infringement. But the fact is that if you willfully infringe a copyrighted work with an aggregate value of $2,500 or more, you have committed a federal felony, even if there's no intent of private financial gain. I think that's probably too far, that we should bring back those criminal penalties for the reasons that Jeff and Jerry discussed. Likewise, we should look at the civil asset forfeiture statutes, which are being interpreted, according to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, as saying any website that's used to facilitate criminal copyright infringement can be seized.
Ex parte.
Ex parte. And we had several websites that were seized and then returned after a year. I think
with no apology.
Yes, and I think that's ridiculous, and we should reform that to ensure that isn't happening, and that we're only seizing assets that are from ill-gotten gains or in the case where you genuinely need to preserve evidence. Otherwise, I think we should not have it sort of strategic websites.
There's a tension here, though, in the previous conversation and the conversation you're having now about criminal penalties, insofar as a point of reference that a lot of you have made is about the importance of startups and startups being harmed and individual or young companies or new companies being impacted negatively by some of the existing copyright doctrines. But at the same time, some of your reform proposals, particularly registration, would be an immense cost that would be imposed upon people who lack both the financial resources as well as the legal institutional knowledge of how to navigate what ultimately will be a very complex system, because that's the only thing the government knows how to introduce is complex systems. I mean, the patent system, the registration system is extremely complex, and even before it was eliminated in 1976, the copyright registration system was a mess, which is why you have the orphan works problem even before 1976, because you didn't have a searchable database. It was unclear who owned what, and things of that sort. So I'm all in favor of talking about, as a property person and as an advocate for IP, I think registration is good, and I'm in favor of an informed discussion about that. My concern is that a lot of the framing of, like, for instance, proposals for registration are done without really thinking through what it means, and especially as evidenced by the fact of the tension in the rhetoric between the concern for startups on enforcement side, but lack of a really awareness or concern for the impact on startups and creator upstarts on the registration and decrease in terms in other sites.
So I want to make sure we leave time here for questions. Quick word, Jerry.
Well, simply to say that, I at least am certainly aware of the transactions costs that would be introduced by a registration scheme. But as you said, in 76, we didn't have the ability to easily search. Today we do. That lowers the transactions cost. So I think it would be a less onerous one today. And imagine that what you're discussing here is a technical problem. But you're right, it would introduce. It's cost-benefit analysis left and right here. And so we just have to do that.
Okay, so we have three topics.
By the way, I don't actually feel as strongly about registration as I do about terms and enforcement mechanisms. But it's not necessarily the case that, again, I think presumption, Adam, in what you're saying is that everybody would want to register their copyrights to enforce them. And frankly, given the short lifespan and low commercial value of most of what is created and technically is supported by copyright, I don't know that most people would need to register, would want to register, would care to register.
Okay, we're going to leave that topic at that. So last three questions before we turn to the audience. We haven't talked about the DMCA. It's the elephant in the room. So should we revisit the DMCA's balance? Is notice and takedown ineffective, considering how fast infringing works get put back up after being taken down? Adam?
I think the DMCA was a valid legislative act in the first place. I don't think it was a coincidence that within a year after the DMCA was created, iTunes goes into existence, because just Steve Jobs can make the case to the music labels that I can get your work up on the internet and secure it with digital rights management and other types of security precautions, and it won't get pirated. And he was able to make that promise on the basis of the DMCA. It served the commercialization function, very important commercialization function. The problem is that technology grows, and the DMCA applies only domestically. And so infringing sites took their peer-to-peer services offshore, and hackers went offshore. And also the multiplication of infringing sites, even domestically, it has been going up exponentially. Paramount Vice President Al Perry from Paramount spoke at my law school last spring, and I was surprised to learn that he said that they send out over something close to 500,000 takedown notices a year. And he said, and they get responses, and they get no response from the majority of them. So it's become, the phrase is whack-a-mole. It's become a whack-a-mole problem. It's not working. I think that was one of the impetuses behind SOPA. It was a legitimate impetus.
So be specific. So let's set aside the foreign row website question, which we've already discussed.
Okay.
How would you change the DMCA regarding domestic sites?
Well, I think the SOPA's. I agreed with SOPA's proposed solution, which is Jeff and Ryan talked about, which is addressing it at the DNS level, at the search level.
For domestic sites, though.
Even for domestic sites.
Ryan?
Well, for domestic sites, So you're saying that a domestic site that is engaged in a substantial amount of infringement should be taken down?
What? That isn't engaged in a
That
substantial
is.
amount. That is engaged in a substantial amount of infringement, with proper notice and proper due process, yes.
I think that's challenging because of the number of startups that have been very successful that were once or perhaps still are occupied by a lot of infringement. If you put that burden on U.S.-based companies that are complying with notice and takedown, I think there's a very serious chilling effect, especially if it's not clear how exactly they have to act to comply with this law. What is a substantial amount of infringement? What level of filtering is required? I think that for domestic sites at least, imposing that burden could really chill free speech and entrepreneurship. I'm skeptical that it's worth doing, although I certainly think it should be on the table.
Larry, what, DMCA, do you think it should be changed? Does it go too far or not far enough?
Well, probably both. I mean, in some sense, you know, I guess, again, I'll just punt here. I mean, like SOPA, it was an experiment for which we have not collected data that we can use to determine if the experiment was successful or unsuccessful.
Jerry?
Well, Adam talks about iTunes springing up a year after SOPA DMCA came out. What's interesting to see is that eventually iTunes dropped DRM as a response to the market's call for this. And the question is, did we need the DMCA in that short term, or could iTunes have sprung up the same? We don't have the data, but I would suggest that is a possibility.
And what do you make of the fact that today DRM is no longer in use by iTunes and other music vendors?
That's my point.
Yeah, he just mentioned that, yes. But that's because of the evolution in technology, and just as the DMCA was itself a response to the evolution of technology, I think then we need another response. And the concerns of Ryan, I think, are legitimately addressed by the fact that just as with the DMCA, the courts cited to and relied upon the substantial case law addressing secondary liability and other types of issues and construing the DMCA. In a new type of law like SOPA, they would do the exact same thing by reference to the DMCA and secondary liability. And so I'm fairly confident that the courts would continue to act in a reasonable manner, and just to the way that they've interpreted and construed the DMCA, they would interpret it in a follow-on statute in the same way.
Okay, so it seems to me the key question here is, given that you're all very skeptical about government in general and legislative processes in particular, do you really think that we can expect Congress to create a reasonable set of affirmative duties for sites that host infringing user-generated content?
Can we get a reasonable act out of Congress? No.
Right. Can I just say that I think
Go ahead. I'm sorry. The one thing that we can do is expect. That's not right. What we can hope for, something that doesn't get more in the way, and so one thing is to avoid the problem of the law standing in the way of technological fixes, like DRM, for example, and the DMCA was actually helpful in facilitating the use of DRM. Larry Lessig's claims that DRM was going to mean that no one would have access to any copyrighted works ever again in the world being completely decimated is both a telling aspect of the importance of technology and also the need for laws to get out of the way of technology, but also I think in ways that I don't really have an answer to, and actually there are people in the audience who deal with this stuff all the time who probably have some thoughts about this. But like Adam says, we need the next iteration of it to progress along with the technology, and of course Congress will screw it up, but they could do better than we have now. I think that's possible, given that technological change is so substantial that it makes what the current law so bad that even a bad new law might not be as bad as status quo. Briefly.
I was just going to say that I think one of the things your question is highlighting is something we haven't touched on, which is sort of the political nature of copyright, the political problem inherent in copyright. And it's simply that for a very long time, the forces who have sought longer, stronger copyright, more protections, have sort of been leading the charge on copyright. And for whatever reason, right now, we are seeing sort of the tide shift back, and we're seeing more people and more interests interested in speaking out on the other side. And I think that does bode well for Congress getting a better outcome from Congress.
So Jerry, do you think that we're likely to see, that now that the dust has settled a bit from SOPA, do you think we're likely to see emerge out of that a more reasoned, careful approach on both sides?
So I don't know, right? This is we're still waiting for that to happen. But part of what we're trying to do in the book, and hopefully with this conversation right now, is do that. Is take the opportunity that SOPA has given us to say, whoa, this isn't just going to go in one direction the way it's always been. Let's have a dialogue. We totally, we recognize the piracy problem. We recognize the changes that technology is having on this piracy problem, and let's discuss how we can solve the piracy problem, or at least attempt to address it as much as we can without having the costs override the benefits. And at the same time, let's look at some of these other concerns that we have about copyright.
If this kind of conversation gets us to the point where everyone understands and has made clear that that even the libertarian, vehement negative response to SOPA is not a response to the underlying, to what animated SOPA, but merely that particular implementation. I think that will be a huge benefit. I mean, and hopefully we can have the same conversation with people on the left.
And can I just say
but maybe.
Can I just say really quickly that I think that you've hit on something very important, which is that the right, as the sort of title of this panel, copyright, the right, including Republicans, conservatives, libertarians, is so well positioned to have this conversation and lead with some solutions here.
Okay, so I want to ask one more question, and then we're going to turn to the audience. I opened this section about practical solutions, noting that copyright lengths and terms is really the thing that primarily animates popular resentment. It's certainly something that law students get very fired up about. The other one, of course, is fair use. So is fair use in crisis? Do we need to do something about fair use? Is there a problem there? Larry, Jerry?
Yeah, well, first of all, I wouldn't say, what did you say, enforcement? You didn't say enforcement. You said terms, and what was the second thing you said?
Well, copyright terms, and then enforcement, I suppose, would be the other category.
Yeah, to me, that's the more important. I think if we're talking about reform, enforcement reform is to me more important than term reform. But yeah, there's a problem with fair use. The problem is Harper Roe v. Nation, which inadvertently or not, kind of collapsed the whole fair use analysis down to this question of commercial, whether there's some, a commercial alternative. And so even people who are using it not for their own commercial purpose, the way the courts have interpreted that case is to say, well, was there an alternative possible commercial use that is foreclosed by this use? Well, and of course the answer is always yes. So fair use essentially disappeared at that point.
Jeff, you maybe think differently?
I would say that fair use is not a huge issue. I'm sure that again, in certain areas it is. I think that's exactly, in fact, the right approach to fair use. That the four factors are kind of not economically sensible, except the market effect one, which has come to predominate, which I think is not a perfect proxy for, but is at least a proxy for the transaction cost aspect, which should determine the
Jerry?
fair use.
I think one issue with fair use is the effect of the DMCA and DRM in a triennial proceeding. And so the idea is that if I have buy a song from iTunes with DRM and I want to put this on a CD, well, I guess maybe the license term would cover that. But you can imagine certain uses of it. I want it to change formats on it so I can play it on my Zune device. This is a personal use. There's no substitution problem here. I'm not trying to scam anybody here, man, as the dude would say. The problem is that you have to go to government with a mother may I sort of approach and ask for permission.
No, or use
just
find
do
the
it.
technology to crack it.
You do it,
Which has been done.
and no one sues you.
Or use what?
And no one sues you.
And no one sues
To the
you. You do it
extent
in your
that
home, and no one
But they
sues
could
you.
sue you.
But they don't.
But they don't.
Okay, okay.
And I think
But you see how
I think that's a really important part of this is
exactly.
that be realistic about the institutional environment which we're talking about. I don't think we want to be turned into a nation of lawbreakers and all of that. I can understand that there's a cost to that, but the reality is that that even when it comes to those the things the law students get exercised about, the grandmother in handcuffs going to jail because she downloaded 4 movies. It happens so infrequently. These
That we should
enforcements
just
are,
not
no,
worry
no,
that
no,
the-
no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying let's put it into perspective. I wouldn't revamp the entire copyright system because the law could be enforced in a way that it never actually has been.
Okay,
So go ahead.
One problem with fair use is that robots aren't very good at figuring out what's fair use and what's copying, which is one example of the error costs that happen when websites that are intermediaries have a burden to take down content on their own, to go out and filter and find potential infringement. That creates a risk that parodies, that limited uses, videos where there's a song in the background could get inadvertently taken down. That is the problem with fair use that I think is difficult to
okay.
it's very
solve.
rare.
Adam gets the last word on fair use, and
And just,
then
yeah.
questions.
And everything as well.
Very quickly, it goes back to Jeff's comment, challenge about fair use to Larry very early on, is that I would disagree with Jeff in one aspect. And fair use is a property type doctrine, in the sense that there is built into the property systems a rule that my mentor and friend Richard Epstein refers to as live and let live. You know, you don't sue every person who commits trespass when they cut across the corner of your grass on your front lawn, even though technically they're committing trespass, and you could sue them. You can get an injunction against them if they do repeatedly. And yet they don't feel chilled in their rights to liberty because of this potential threat of trespass. There's this live and let live rule. I can cut across your corner of your grass, you can cut across mine. I think this is what Jim was speaking out when he was talking about permissible leakage. You know, there's a certain amount of permissible personal activity that occurs in homes. It always has historically. Fair use evolved out of that as a judicially made doctrine in the 19th century. And I think it exactly reflects the issue that Jeff was talking about, that it's only when it rises to the level of interfering with commercial business models that we then,
Okay,
So then what was
having
the-
started, I'm sorry, we have to go to questions. Having started a little late, we're just going to take 2 questions here, and then I'll give a chance for just very final comments. So, and if anybody desperately needs to leave, you're welcome to do so, but otherwise, we'll take 2 questions. If anyone has a burning desire to ask a question. I see, who can hold their hand highest? How about Phil over there? Phil wins the highest hand contest. Brief question, please.
Brief. Okay. Phil Corwin. Since we're having such a high-level discussion, whatever the term and scope of a copyright, is it more important for good policy to emphasize control or compensation? And just to put that in a concrete framework, say you're a record company, and I'm riffing off Mitch Glazer, who mentioned this at Cato last week. If it's terrestrial broadcaster, no control, no compensation. Same broadcast over the internet, no control, but one compulsory license. Pure internet radio, non-interactive, no control, different license. Totally interactive internet broadcast, total control and compensation, whatever the private parties negotiate. So that's kind of the range of possibilities.
Okay, reactions?
So I think the reason that law students, as you mentioned, Baron, sort of latch onto terms is because it's an easy sort of vector of the copyright, the terms of copyright that you can sort of focus on. But there are lots. And so compulsory licensing is one of them. I'm not a fan of compulsory licensing. I think you should be able to negotiate your terms as the holder of a work and as a person who wants to license it. And as a result of not having compulsory licensing, I don't think we should have price fixing by a copyright royalty board that sets what the prices are.
Any other comments? Last question. Tom, please. There's a microphone. You could just, brief question, please.
Actually, really enjoyed the panel. Thanks a lot for hosting everybody's opinions. And just a question for Jerry. I mean, Jerry, I'm reading your book. I don't think I can agree that it is. Well, I think copyright unbalanced may be a bit unbalanced, but. In your actual proposal for copyright reform, after the fourth analogy where copyrights are compared to either the devil, Mephistopheles, and Faust, or evil, we get into the actual reform proposal, and then it ends up being 4 separate violations of our WTO obligations, including relating to term, relating to formalities, relating to granting protection to foreign authors. And
I think we get your question.
Why could we not, and this is what I don't understand, why would we steer right into the teeth of potentially withdrawing from the WTO when we could try to work on works legislation. It's been stalled for a while because of the book search mess, but that's kind of behind us, and solve the underlying traceability problem. Why doesn't it make sense to work within the system rather than trying to take it on globally?
So you're referring to Tom Bell's chapter. You've asked a very, very complex question. I think the book, I think, answers all of your questions. I think Tom Bell directly answers why sort of escaping burn would not be as terrible as some people would think.
But to be clear, those are Tom Bell's arguments, not necessarily yours.
Excuse me?
Those are Tom Bell's arguments, not necessarily
Those are
yours.
Tom Bell's arguments, and I do not accept the characterization
Okay. Well,
of the chapter.
But this question has come up on the panel. Some of the things that have been proposed here are not consistent with U.S. treaty obligations.
So let me answer that question, right? Which is that yes, some of the things we're discussing here would violate treaties, and the question is, do we want to reconsider those treaties? So two things. One is, I hope we remember that we're still a sovereign nation, and we can decide to reconsider our international obligations. So that's number one. And number two, this is all in the interest. And by the way, Tom Bell's proposal is to return to the 1790 Copyright Act, under which, for example, music would not be copyrightable. Do you get the hint here that perhaps this is a thought experiment? Now, Tom maybe doesn't like me characterizing it that way. He might be actually serious about that. But it's useful as a thought experiment, okay? And it has to be taken in that spirit.
Okay, any final words on that? Otherwise, I want to give you each just 30 seconds, just in particular, today, what have you heard that you actually think we agree on and that can be done and that maybe Congress could do this session? Adam, you kick us off, and Larry will have the last word.
Well, I'm happy to hear. I'm happy to hear that we all care about piracy and that its impact, and that. But I also think that the issue of treaty obligations is a real concern and a legitimate concern, and that really is a big factor that needs to be taken into account. I think in any discussions about copyright reform, and those discussions have to be done very seriously rather than in a flip way, in a rhetorical way.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the possibility for SOPA 2, maybe we should probably use different acronyms to avoid the problem.
Yes.
Is encouraging. I think there's that discussion about piracy, the acknowledgement of the problem, and the possibility of a palatable legislative fix is encouraging.
Ryan?
I also think it's encouraging that we might see an enforcement law, but I don't think that it's likely that this session will be the one to see it. I think it's perhaps more likely that, at least from the standpoint of political support, a modest piece of legislation designed to address orphan works might be feasible. Something like Jerry's idea to create an affirmative defense when a user has taken reasonable steps to try to find the author and hasn't been able to. Perhaps that's in the cards this session. But it could also be that no major copyright legislation is enacted this session.
What I find most encouraging is that I hear from folks like Adam and Jeff and Ryan a very open mind about the scope of copyright and real concern about piracy, but also real open-mindedness to revisiting its contours. And what's interesting is that this is all happening within the Big Tent right. And I think this right is well positioned to lead next time there is a social type move to say, you know what, we believe in property rights, and so we want to secure them, but we also want to make sure that they're well contoured.
So when I made my notes last night, I found myself writing the following: absent rhetoric and religion, this would be easy. And then I realized, it also has something to do with copyright. It's a sort of bigger issue than that. And unfortunately, taking religion and rhetoric out of this discussion, I don't think is possible, and therefore I don't expect anything to happen.
Well, on that happy note, I would just remind you all this is part of an ongoing series that we're doing. We do sort of doing two flavors of events recently. One has been debates that are really charged and heated, and those have been a lot of fun. We will do more of those next year, but we also are doing this series where we're really trying to find common ground. We do it on communications law, copyright, two more planned on privacy and on emergency, public safety, cybersecurity issues. I hope you'll come to those next year. And in general, keep all of our organizations in mind, Tech Freedom, the International Center for Law and Economics, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And if you just join me in thanking all of our panelists today, I hope to see you next time.
Well, thanks for that.